Hey there, kids. We are now starting chapter 2 of the Oddmire book, Changeling. And here we go. Oh, I wanted to show it to you. Woo! That's what. Chapter 2. Twins. Annie Burton distinctively remembered giving birth to one baby. One. She had been there. She had counted. 10 fingers, 10 toes, one baby, but now twins. There had been a great deal of talk that first morning, and it was scarcely midday before the house had filled with noisy onlookers. Father Lewis had brought rosaries. Old Jim had tossed salt all over the house. Nosy Mrs. Grouse from across the road had been the first to say the word aloud. Goblins. It's goblins, I swear. They've stolen a baby before, you know, right here in Ensborough. They used to talk about it all the time. My grandmother knew the family. Helen, please, Annie began, but Mrs. Grouse ignored her. Once upon a time, there was a child whom the goblins stole away. That's how the story goes. She was a beautiful child with joyful dimples and thick curls of rich brown hair, and the goblins came, and they just took her away. When I was growing up, it was fairies, said old Jim Warner. No, it was the goblins, Mrs. Grouse continued forcefully, and they left one of their own in place of the child. A changeling. It was an awful thing, a monster in disguise. For 3 days, the child's parents fed the vile little creature, fretted over it, thinking it was their own flesh and blood, and then, one morning, the goblin could hide no longer. It struck, tore up the nursery, shrieked like the devil, and when the frightened parents came running, it killed the husband dead, while his poor wife watched. Drove her mad to see it. She chased the evil thing into the forest, so they say, and she never came back out again. You've got your stories all mixed up, old Jim grumbled. That's the legend of the witch in the Wild Wood. And she never had a husband in the first place. She was a single mother, and the fairies came and stole her away, stole her only daughter, but nobody in town believed her. And then, when she went into the forest to try to get her baby back, the fairies cursed her to wander the deep dark forever, snatching up wayward children in place of her own. It was the goblins, Mrs. Grouse asserted. Fairies, huffed old Jim. You're both talking about fairy tales, said Annie Burton. This is madness. They're not monsters. They're just children. One of them is, said Mrs. Grouse. If there really is a witch in the woods, Joseph Burton said, his face stoic, and she lost her baby to magical creatures, then maybe she's still out there. Maybe she would know how to recognize a changeling. There is no witch in the woods, said Father Lewis. It was the first time the old man had spoken since his arrival, and his voice was low and soft. There never was a witch. There was just a woman. The room was silent as all eyes turned to the aging pastor. The stories are wrong, he continued. There was a woman who used to live alone in the woods, that much is true. I don't know anything about fairies or goblins or any of that. I think it was just regular old grief that sent her out there. I met her just once, when I was still a young man. I went walking along a path in the forest and got turned around. The woman was real, and she was sad. She had indeed suffered a great loss. The poor old thing just wanted to be left alone. But if there's truth to any of it, Joseph Burton allowed the words to trail off. His eyes were on the back window of the swaying trees. The woman was already quite old back then, said the pastor gently. I'm sure she's long past now, God rest her. That hasn't stopped the stories about that poor lady from growing into absolute nonsense. It's not nonsense, mumbled old Jim. For once, Mrs. Grouse seemed to agree with him. Indeed, it's not. Proof enough is in the bassinet, she insisted. It isn't natural. It isn't right. It's goblins. I swear it's changeling. Nobody wanted to agree with the superstitious woman, but nobody could truly say she was wrong either. You couldn't live your life beside the wildwood and not believe at least a few of the old stories. They burned sage and poked both children with silver, but the babies only sneezed and giggled and batted at the spoons. Nobody in town was quite certain what to look for in a changeling. Eventually, somebody got the idea to send away for advice from an expert they had heard about in Fiddleham. Iron. The expert advised them by post. Touch the child with iron within the first 3 days. By the time this counsel arrived, 7 days had passed. They tried anyway, but both babies just grappled at the fireplace poker and got soot all over their swaddling clothes. And so, after a week of dithering and debating, it was decided, for lack of a better option, that they would simply have to wait. The goblin child would reveal its own true nature eventually. The goblin, after all, couldn't resist getting up to all manner of mischief. They would just have to be wary and watchful. Until then, the Burtons would care for both boys as their own. Bit by bit, the neighbors ceased stopping by to gawk and speculate until, one evening, only Mrs. Grouse remained. A goblin, Annie, she reminded her unnecessarily before she left for the night. A horrible goblin changeling sleeping side by side with your own flesh and blood. Good night, Ellen. The boys were indeed sleeping side by side as Annie closed the door behind her. Annie could not help but notice that her own baby, whichever one it was, had slept more soundly since the arrival of this mysterious twin. They seemed equally calmed by each other's presence and distressed by their separation. They would cry ceaselessly when she attempted to move them into different rooms, but quieted at once when they were back in each other's company, until soon they would be snoring peacefully. She watched them for a long time, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing, until the changeling's natural mischief gave the wicked thing away. She would let the matter rest along with the boys. Her boys. No reason to rush the matter, Annie thought, taking a deep breath. After all, they would know the truth soon enough. And that's the end of chapter 2. Very cool book. Chapter 3. I can show you a picture. I know you guys like that. There's chapter 3, and we'll start that sometime tomorrow. Wait, I hope your day has been a good one. Excuse me, my allergies are much better. Yes! I don't mind the rain. I hope you guys don't either. Anyway, take good care of yourselves, and I'm looking forward to chapter 3.